They accuse me of being a bigot and a climate change denier, which is weird since, as those who watch my show know, I actually accept the IPCC estimates on climate change. I just think that, as we will discuss, the left's plan for stopping it is impractical and designed not to stop it. They also say that I spew Christian conservative propaganda. Thanks also to the University of Michigan History Department, which apparently is sponsoring an event titled When Provocateurs Dabble in History, Ben Shapiro and the Enlightenment, which seems mean. It is set to critique my new book, The Right Side of History, How Reason and Moral Purpose Made the West Great, which will be fascinating. I mean, I'm sure there are some people here who are history majors. It'll be really fascinating to hear how these history professors critique a book they haven't read since it's not released until next week. So apparently they're not only history majors, they are future majors. They're clairvoyant. The truth is, it would have been a lot more fun if the professors had shown up to ask questions so that we could initiate an honest discussion, but better not to do that. So instead, I will encourage everybody here and people watching online to go ahead and watch the video version of their lecture. I hope they're taping it, so that you can hear what they have to say, because I actually like multiple opinions. I'm in favor of hearing multiple points of view. In fact, I've already checked out a copy of Dean Angela Dillard's book on race and conservatism because it actually sounds interesting. I'll just say this. If they're really going, just short form, if they're really going with the notion that the Enlightenment is about enlightenment, about racial narcissism, they really ought to check their privilege. This university is the product of Enlightenment ideas of reason, and their paychecks are dependent on the continued interest in those ideas. Well, at least that event sounds somewhat interesting. I can't say that I'm nearly as interested in Stop Trump Ann Arbor's counter event. Apparently that's a protest that will include songs, Antifa cheerleaders, and glitter. First off, I don't know what Antifa cheerleaders do. Do they dress in masks and then club you with pom-poms? Also, will this glitter come from the third grade classrooms where they learn about politics? The title of their event is The Sound of Incel, the Ben Shapiro Musical Experience. Now, listen, I am certainly flattered that these delightful and talented people have decided to write an entire musical, apparently, about my sex life. By the way, I have 2 children. So it's awesome. Thanks. I think we can say this much. We can safely say that those who spend their evenings play acting with glitter while singing songs about my sex life aren't going to get laid anytime in the near future. I will say that I really do actually want to see this. Apparently, it was based on Rocky Horror Picture Show. That's what I have been told, which was disappointing. I thought it was going to be based on The Sound of Music. Like, if you're going to title a musical called The Sound of Incel, it has to be based on The Sound of Music, because I was looking forward to hearing them sing, our IQs are 16, going on 17. Okay, fine. So enough of that. The title of this lecture is The Government is the Bully. I think the truth of that statement is pretty self-evident. Government is, in essence, a giant gun. It is a giant force for compulsion. Government inherently is backed by compulsion. Otherwise, it would just be a voluntary association. It would be, as Democrats like to think of it, the things we do together. It is the things we do together also backed by a gun. Well, sometimes compulsion is justified. I'm not an anarchist. Very few people are. Sometimes government compulsion is justified. Determining when government compulsion is justified is really the difference between various political points of view in the United States and also in Europe. In sort of classical Enlightenment, or Enlightenment theory, apparently, the Hobbesian view of government was that rights come from government. Without government, we would all destroy each other, life would be nasty, brutish, and short, and thus government had the ability to invade our rights at any time, since we required a Leviathan to protect us from one another. So there was no such thing as an illegitimate use of government power. The government was there. It created our rights. We owe our rights to the government, so wherever the government decided to use compulsion was appropriate. The Lockean notion of government is the notion of government upon which the United States is essentially based. And that notion is that there are natural rights that pre-exist government, that these rights come from nature or from nature's God, as it's expressed in the Declaration of Independence, and that these rights include the rights to life, liberty, and property. The Lockean belief is that in a state of nature, meaning pre-existing government, we formed communities, groups of families, in order to protect those rights, and then eventually we delegated protection of those rights to the government. If governments were to invade those rights, then the compulsion would become illegitimate. So I'll go through each of those briefly. Life. The government has been delegated the enforcement, obviously, of the right to life. This means the prosecution of criminals. It means the provision for the mutual defense. It means that the government does have the capacity to tax for police use so as to ensure that our lives are protected. It also means that government has the ability to protect all lives, the unborn included, which is why when you hear the quote-unquote libertarian argument against the pro-life position, that doesn't make a lot of sense. If you believe that there is life to be protected, then the government obviously has a role in protecting that life, whether it is inside or outside the womb. One of the greatest flaws in all of human history is humanity's unique ability to define away inconvenient human life. Whether we are talking about slaves in the United States or across the world, or Jews during the Holocaust, or the unborn. That would be government abdicating and overthrowing its most fundamental duty. Okay, liberty is supposed to be protected by government, and sometimes that requires the use of compulsion. The government was designed to protect your freedoms, not to invade them. So the government is supposed to protect people from, for example, enslaving you. In the Lockean view, liberty was defined as freedom from, not freedom to, meaning that it wasn't that the government was supposed to provide you all sorts of resources. It was that you were free in a state of nature without anybody else imposing their will on you. That's what liberty was defined as. In sort of modern political parlance, we call these negative liberties. This was the founding idea of liberty. Liberty involved not being restricted by government or anyone else from fulfilling your purpose so long as you didn't harm anyone else. The only question of government compulsion was really about externalities, meaning you do something, it affects a third party, and now it's government's job to come in and stop you because you get to wave around your hand until you hit somebody in the face. At that point, you've invaded their liberty. Now, the modern left has suggested that freedom is actually about something else. Freedom from want. The freedom to have the sort of health care that you want. The freedom of receiving an income, whether you are unable or, in the words of AOC, unwilling to work, which is a theory that has yet to be proved out anywhere on Earth successfully. But that is not freedom. That is excising from, that is taking from others, since these goods do not exist automatically. If you say you have a right to a product, that means that you have a right to compel somebody to make that product for you. That's a very different idea of what liberty is than what the founders thought, which is that you have a right to be free from the compulsion of others. Okay, finally, property in the Lockean vision. So John Locke and the founding fathers believed that property was basically your labor, that your labor was an extension of your innate creative capacity as a human being made in God's image. Land ownership, for example, came from mixing your labor with the land. Capital was merely labor in another form. It was the script that we use when we trade with one another as shorthand. I owe you X hours of labor. That's all that money is. Right? The government is empowered to protect your individual creative capacity from the encroachment of others. It is empowered to stop other people from stealing your property. The government is also empowered to protect your property from externalities and to protect the commons from externalities. Right? This is where environmental regulation would come in. Somebody's not allowed to simply pump toxic waste onto your property. That is them damaging you. And that's true if you have a commonly held piece of property. You have a common waterway. People aren't allowed to simply pump toxic sludge in there. The Lockean vision of government would allow government compulsion to stop that sort of thing. Okay, with all of that said, what does that say about taxes in this sort of conservative point of view? There are some folks who say all taxation is theft. Well, most taxation is theft. Okay, some taxation is not. Taxation is theft when it is not part of the bigger bargain, the essential contract we forged with the government to protect our life, liberty, and property. In other words, when two people vote to take a third guy's money and then distribute it among themselves, that is obviously theft. And it's theft because it's backed by the government gun, and it is theft because it is compulsion, whether or not people voted for it. If a majority votes to remove the rights of a minority, that is still tyranny. The founders were deeply concerned about the tyranny of the majority. How about equality before the law? This is the innate notion that we are all created in God's image, and it means that we must be treated equally under the law. That does not mean that the effect of every law is equal, of course. So government compulsion is supposed to take place at the level of the objective, meaning that everybody is supposed to be treated the same by the law. But that does not mean the effect of every law on everybody is equal. Obviously, it is not. We all have different drives. We all have different motivations. Some of us have more of a drive to steal things. That does not mean that we are supposed to go easy on those of us who have more of a drive to steal things. Government is capable of using compulsion, again, in the situations mentioned before. Whenever people are trying to encroach on life, liberty, or property, that's when the government gets involved. Okay, so when isn't government justified? When does government become the bully? When government is activated to invade the rights of other people, even for the purported good of the many. That's when the government is the bully. And that is what we are seeing increasingly these days. The call for socialism, in essence, is a call to invade the rights of others on behalf of yourself or on behalf of the greater good. Folks who portray socialism as inherently altruistic are full of it. Socialism is not inherently altruistic. Socialism is about sticking your hand in somebody else's pocket because you voted to do so. That is not altruistic. It is not kind. It is not decent. It is not just. Free markets are kind, decent, and just because they are predicated on a basic notion, which is that you are an individual. You own your own labor. You are capable of running your own life. You're capable of exercising your reason, and nobody has the capacity to steal things from you just because they feel it's unfair that you've been successful in some way.